Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. Thank you for joining me in the first of a two-part mini-series exploring the legacy of Jacob Zylberstein and Sara Szor Zylberstein, who survived the horrors of the Holocaust while the majority of their families devastatingly did not. To help us bear witness to their lives and to share in the continuation of their stories unbroken, I am joined in conversation with their daughter, Deborah Zylberstein Reed, who has had an amazing life in her own right. I'll also be speaking to her son John in the next release of the podcast. In part one of today's podcast, Deb reflects on her formative years and how her early identity was shaped by two worlds, that of Melbourne's idyllic South Eastern Suburbs with a loving family, contrasted by revelations of her parents' history that emerged throughout Deb's early life. In part two, Deb shares her father's story of survival during the Shoah. Jacob's story is one of incredible resilience and twists and turns that are horrific and heartbreaking, but also highlight the limitlessness of the human spirit. Part 3 of the podcast details Deb's mother Sara's story of life before, during and after the Holocaust. Sara's story is equally incredible, with not only her survival to 1945, but the way she lived her life to its fullest for her entire life. In part 4, Deb discusses her adult life and how the choices she made and continues to make have led to a difficult balancing act between bearing the responsibility and weight of her family history while also forging a new and independent path. Deb currently works as Head of Student Services at Idyllic College and is the Chair of the Special Education Network of Jewish Schools in Melbourne. She is the proud and dedicated mother of John and Sara, who are forging wonderful careers in performing arts spaces in Australia and abroad. This love of the arts and performing surely stemmed from Deb's work as a drama teacher and community theatre director. Deb has had a rich and varied life that spans continents. I absolutely loved my conversation with Deb, and I know you will too. Please share the podcast with family and friends, subscribe on your podcast player of choice, and leave a review. If you would like to get in touch, you can reach me on theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. And now, without further delay, I bring you Deborah Zylberstein Reed. Deb, welcome to Their Stories Unbroken.
Thanks, Matt. Delighted to be here.
Deb, can we get started basically at the beginning? I would love to know about where you grew up and about your early life, your parents and some of the early memories you've had.
I grew up in 26 Eddies Grove, Bentley, a very modest lower middle class home in a very modest lower middle class suburb. I went to Bentley West Primary School. Those were the days where you walked to school by yourself, crossed a road even, had the key to the house around my neck, had to use a box to reach the front door. So in many ways, a very typical idyllic childhood. Played with the kids in the street. We played the Secret Seven and the Faraway Tree and all those lovely imaginative games. My parents owned a fruit shop. My father had a truck that he would take to Victoria Market every morning about 3 o'clock in the morning. And the truck became a staging ground on the weekends for all kinds of adventures, a stage for performances, a place to hide in hide-and-seek games. So very, on the surface, a very typical Aussie childhood, but that was very much at a surface level. Underneath that level was the, I think, ever-present weight, shadow, cloud, spectre, choose one of those words, of the fact that my parents were Holocaust survivors. And almost incrementally, in a very slow drip fashion, did I start to understand what that meant. And of course, my parents were very circumspect about what they shared at a young age, but as I say, in a slow drip fashion, that was really revealed to me from small things like a friend from primary school, I think maybe grade 1, comes home with me to play after school. My mother comes home from working in the shop and she sees the number on my mother's arm and says, "What's that number on your mother's arm? Is that your phone number? Can't she remember it?" And I had never thought about the number on my mother's arm. My aunt had one. Most of my parents' friends had them. It seemed very normal. And I had to ask my mother, "What is that?" And then I remember starting to hear about grandparents. I didn't know what a grandparent was. Most of my parents' friends were Holocaust survivors, so the family friends I played with, they didn't have grandparents. Suddenly at school, people were getting birthday presents from grandparents, Christmas presents, staying over the weekend, and I didn't know what a grandparent was.
So when you did ask your mum, did she answer you with the truth?
Good question. I'm not sure I can quite remember back that far. My mother really did not want to talk about her experiences. Every Holocaust survivor has a different level of, I suppose, exposure and disclosure, but she did not want to talk about it. When I would press her, she would say, "What do you want to know for?" My mother was very protective, I think, didn't want her children to know what she'd gone through. My father, on the other hand, was very open, and I don't know where he got the wisdom to tell us what we needed to know without being too gruesome or ghoulish. My mother did like to talk about little victories that maybe we'll talk about in the next part when we talk about their histories. She always kept it very positive. And my father too focused on bravery and strength and resilience. But you would never know from the way my parents lived their lives that they had been through what they had been through. They loved to party. They were really reclaiming, I think, the youth they didn't have. I used to love watching my mother get ready. She had this very old-fashioned dresser with a large mirror. I'd love to watch her doing her hair and putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. They loved to do that. They were snappy dresses. They liked to look very smart. I don't think we had much money. Certainly not something I was aware of growing up. Often you just know what you know and how you live. We had one car, a 1959 Holden, and we had one television, an old one. I think in those days that wasn't too uncommon. But we went on an occasional holiday to Warburton, picnics in Lilydale, but it was a modest, middle class or lower middle class existence, but it was very happy, it was very cheery. I did not go to a Jewish school. There was talk about me sitting scholarship exam for Mount Scopus, but I was a bit of a stubborn child and I wanted to go to the local high school with my friends. So that's very much my early life. But I must say I also remember my mother's nightmares. She didn't talk about it, but certainly the horrors revisited her at night, and I remember being a bit scared of that. And I sort of describe it as, when you talk to your parents about a boogeyman in the house or something scary, if my mother were to talk to me about the boogeyman who visited her in her dreams, the boogeyman is not unreal. It is a truth that existed for her all her life. And I think we were very fortunate, my sister and I, that my parents were so extraordinarily normal. And in fact, and I know perhaps I'm jumping the sections of this podcast, but their Holocaust survivors were offered some reparations from Germany. And in order to receive those reparations, you had to have an interview with a psychiatrist to determine the level of your psychological damage. And the psychiatrist at the end of the interview with my mother said, "Are you sure you went through all these camps and everything?" And my mother goes, "Yes, what do you mean, am I sure?" He said, "Because I'm having trouble certifying you as having psychological damage." And in fact, I don't think my mother ever did receive those reparations because she had, for whatever reason, I think there was some damage that showed up in a way that I didn't understand probably until my adulthood, in the way in which she conducted her life. But it was subtle and not really about being a mother. So these are the things that open up to you about your parents as real human beings, not just as your parents. There were some very quirky things about my parents had a fruit shop, and of course we ate all the leftovers and however they were to be produced. But my father could not throw away bread. He couldn't do it. So he would, if it was stale, he would crumble it into the backyard so that the birds would have it, or they'd turn it into breadcrumbs or croutons. But it was the one thing he could not throw away. And even though my mother became really an atheist post-war, even though she'd grown up in a religious family before the war, she still could not cook with milk and meat. Couldn't do it because she was raised in a kosher home where you didn't mix milk and meat. So to this day, I can't cook with milk and meat either. You know, cheese on pasta bolognese just doesn't work for me. So it is funny how the trickling of the generations in quirky ways has maintained itself.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your mum became an atheist but was brought up in that religious home, and we'll get into her life as well a bit later on. But what was, you talked about growing up just like any regular Aussie family on the surface at least, but your parents obviously came from Europe, Poland.
Yes.
So did they speak English well at home? Did they have to learn it? And did you feel just regular Australian, because migration was such a huge thing after World War II and you would have seen it all around you, Jewish and non-Jewish alike.
Yeah.
But what did you feel about your identity, and what was your family pushing, I guess, with your identity?
My parents, by the time I was born, they'd been in Australia 5 years, and they both had pretty good English, strong accents, but pretty good English. My mother had had more education than my father. Jews in Poland did not get to go to high school, and my father pretty early on went to work in a factory with his own father. But my mother, because the Russians occupied the eastern part of Poland, went to a Russian school, had to sit up the back and had to win a scholarship and a whole lot of other discriminatory practices, but she did go, so she was more educated. And she had learned Latin, and this helped her a lot. So she taught herself English and to really read and write English by reading the newspaper, and she used her Latin knowledge that she clung on to really sort of teach her how to read and write. And her English, her command of grammar was really excellent. I don't remember perhaps in my first couple of years, but my first language was Yiddish. My parents spoke Polish to each other, but the Polish language held a lot of negative emotions for them, and they didn't love it, and they didn't want to recall it. My mother spoke a very good Yiddish, a very educated Yiddish. My father, a ghetto Yiddish. He learned it in the ghetto. But they did speak Yiddish. But a family friend who looked after me a lot spoke Yiddish. My first language was Yiddish. I lost it completely, I'm sad to say. So that was how we began my life. In terms of culturally, food was the first thing I noticed that made me look different. I mean, I would take Polish sausage sandwiches to school, and my friends were eating white bread with the crust cut off with jam, and I had rye bread with thick crusts and, of
Delicious.
course, delicious now, oh my goodness.
Yes.
But try swapping for a jam sandwich with a Polish rye bread sandwich back in the 1950s. Forget about it. It didn't happen. Bentley West was not a highly migrant school. We had a few migrants. We did have religious instruction, and there was Jewish religious instruction. They had people from the local synagogues come and do it, which was kind of cool. It wasn't a particularly Greek and Italian area. My father had all the Greek and Italian contact and exposure by being at the market every morning. It was the only place he could get a decent coffee, he always remarked. Those cultural differences were a bit notable. And Friday nights, even though my mother was an atheist, we always had the traditions, and we said the prayers over the candles and the wine and the challah. My mother would go to synagogue only for weddings and bar mitzvahs. My father would go on the high holy days, and my sister and I went with him. But we felt very connected to the overall Jewish community, and my sister and I both went to Jewish youth movements. My sister went to SCIF, which is a Yiddish-speaking youth movement. That's very culturally Jewish but not Zionist. That was for my mother. And I went to Hashomer Hatzair, which is a Zionist socialist youth movement, and my father had been in that before the war, so I went for my father, so they got one of each.
Oh, wow. Do you think that changed the way that you and your sister embraced Jewish identity growing up?
That's a really good question. I've never had that question before. I think so, in a way, because SCIF was more cultural, was more about language and music and art and traditions. My sister saw it more as a social opportunity, and I became very political by going to Hashomer. In fact, sort of became full of questions about Zionism, which is a very interesting thing to say in this climate. And I think at that time, our, as a youth movement, interpretation of Zionism, which of course it had been before the war, was that the solution to the Jewish problem, and of course to the problem of the Jews in the diaspora, was Israel, and that all Jews should go and live in Israel. And I found that difficult to embrace. I saw, a bit like the SCIF view, that a Jewish diaspora was a good thing, you know, that there was a positive to Jews living all over the world, perhaps in the same way as, you know, the Greek community lives all over the world, and so on. So interesting.
It just leads me to another question, and you talked about, you know, Zionism as a word that's, you know, everywhere today in good and bad ways, and we'll get to that maybe towards the end of our podcast. But what was your it's interesting to me as a historian to go, what was the idea of Israel in your early life? What was happening in the world that you recall and remember that might have been of debate or controversy or not, something positive too?
Well, the 1967 war, I was 12, so I remember it well because it was my first year going to Hashomer Hatzair, and I really remember it well because my sister was nearly 7 years older than I was 19, and she was ready to get on a plane and go to Israel, as were thousands, possibly tens of thousands of young Jews all over the world at that time. And of course, by the time anybody started thinking about a passport or a flight, the war was over. It was a 6-day war. But I remember the conversations at the kitchen table. By the way, picture a 1950s green Laminex kitchen table with the metal rim around it.
Yes, I remember them well.
Remember those?
I had one growing up in the 90s, so that shows how old that table must have been.
Every time I say my parents' kitchen table, I have to picture it, and I want you and the listeners to picture it too. And on the, the padded Laminex chairs.
Yep. Lino floor?
Lino floor, of course. It was a big deal when we got carpet in the bedrooms.
Oh, yes.
That was a big deal. I remember the conversation really well and starting to cry when I thought of my sister going to a war. It was overwhelming, and yet I remember my father being so proud that she would want to go. And the discussion was more, yes, but are they taking girls? What can girls do? And my sister was infuriated by that. Well, of course, women have been known to help in all wars, and we do so many. Anyway, of course, we well know that now the IDF is a very egalitarian fighting force when it comes to women. But I remember that conversation.
I find that interesting that she was brought up in the Yiddish cultural Jewish space but still felt that attachment and need to go. What do you think? I mean, you can't speak for her, but what drove that, do you think?
Oh, I think Israel and Zionism was talked about a lot in our house. And my uncle, who was married to my mother's sister, he had family in Israel who were there both before and came after the war. And I remember him going to Israel. It was very exciting to visit them. My father was very strong in his beliefs that it would happen again. There would be another time when Jews would be abandoned by the world. Let that hang in the air for a minute, because it certainly feels that we're back there. But he was sure of it, and he said, the difference is there's a place we can go. Again, this might be a bit out of order, but my parents' first requests for visa entry was to Israel after the war, but my mother was pregnant with my sister and they denied the visa. They needed fighting forces in 1948, so they could not afford to have a new mother and a new baby that they would have to look after. They barely had enough food for themselves and the people who could fight for the state of Israel. But Zionism was very strong in our house, and I think my mother believed in the state of Israel. She just didn't have the Zionist background my dad did.
When was the first time, Deb, that you heard your mother's story or a parent's story? Who was first?
Definitely my dad.
Okay.
Definitely my dad. And he told us tidbits and things that he accomplished and lots of things he was very proud of. And those positive things were what he hung his hat on. Most parents say things like, don't waste food, children are starving in Biafra, or whatever the latest famine is. But my parents didn't. My father would say, I know what it is to be hungry, and I know what it is to value the food on the table. Mind you, my father was hilarious in that after my mother died and he was looking after himself, you could not trust him to go to the supermarket, go shopping, because he would buy 12 of everything, and I'd say, what are you going to do with 12 cans of corn? He couldn't help himself.
Yeah.
He was preparing for famine, but he was very conscious of how fortunate we were. Almost all our life lessons were taught with the deprivation and the pain and suffering of the Holocaust as a background. Example, I came home from a class at school, year 7, I believe, and I was complaining about the teacher. My father lost it and said, I don't ever want to hear you complain about school again, ever. Look at you. You've got a uniform. You have a safe school. You don't have to sit up the back. You can eat lunch with everybody else. I never had that. And then I never had an education because I lost those years in the Holocaust. I don't want to hear it. I did never complain about school again, I assure you. And grades were important. How lucky are you to go to a school? You value it. You do your homework. You respect the fact that this is a privilege. It's not a right. And you're a Jew. It can be taken away from you. And that was the other thing about education, that, you know, my mother understood so well. She had this little bit of Latin, this little bit of high school education. 1941, of course, that all ended when the Nazis took over her town. But until then, and she was by then 17, she'd had quite a bit of high school education. She said all through the deprivation of the Holocaust, she had that. And she held on to the education she'd had when she came to Australia and relied on it. So they can take everything away, all your material possessions, but education lives within you. So that's very much how I heard my parents' story. And for example, I'd say, how come you're not going to shul on Rosh Hashanah? Why aren't you going? Well, I don't believe in God. How come you don't believe in God? Well, how could I believe in a God that did this to me and my family? Because I believed in him. And then I'd say, well, did your parents go to shul? Oh, yes, they were. So that's how it went. Yeah, they were religious, and my great-grandfather was a scribe, and then I'd say, so what happened, you know, when in 1939? So as I got older, my questions got a little more, I guess, sophisticated and could ask more. She gave me very little. I heard a little bit more from my aunt, her sister, who survived with her, but I had to put a lot of pieces together.
Deb, do you mind telling the story of both parents, but we'll start with maybe your father?
Yes, I'd be happy to. My father was born in a town called Lodz in Poland. It was known as Little Manchester because it was a textile hub. And my father's father worked in a textile mill, and when my father finished primary school, he went to work in the textile mill as well. He had two older brothers and a younger sister, and one of them survived the Holocaust, and his is a very interesting story, maybe for another podcast.
More than welcome to share anyone's story that is related, yes.
So in 1939, my father was 17, and he put up his age in September when the Nazis invaded Poland to go to Warsaw and support the Polish army in trying to fight the Nazis. Was not very successful, and in 2 weeks after trying to hold off the Nazi army, he then returned to Lodz. The Lodz ghetto was created, I believe, in about January 1940, and it was about 1.6 square miles. I'm sorry, I should have had that converted into kilometres, and held about 144,000 people. A sidestep, we did go back to Poland with my father for a family roots trip, and we saw the apartment that they were in the ghetto, which was pretty amazing. And, of course, it was incredibly overcrowded. They had a lot of Jews from Germany who were put in the ghetto. It was on the German side of Poland. And my father went to work on the building sites, and there were building sites both inside the ghetto and outside the ghetto, and they were building housing for German troops and also repairing roads and so on that were damaged as a result of the war. He was very fortunate to be under a man whom he idolised and immortalised in many ways in our family, Engineer Gutmann. He was an engineer, and he headed up the building groups. And because he worked, my father got food. So I think a loaf of bread and maybe some soup or a vegetable. And he really had to feed his entire family on that. That was extremely challenging. His parents couldn't work. There was nothing they were given to do. His little sister had polio when she was a child and had a withered arm, and really couldn't do manual labour. And of the two brothers, one of them had married and was trying to now support his own family. And the older brother had escaped to Russia, so was never in the ghetto.
Okay.
And that's a story in and of itself. So he was looking after his whole family. And he met the very infamous Chaim Rumkowski, who, if you know anything about the Lodz ghetto and what happened in Poland, you will know that he was a Nazi collaborator. And I'm going to say he was a Nazi collaborator. I don't think it's controversial at all. And
can you give a little bit of that background for those that may not know? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the deal was made that if you cooperated, then we'd help look after you. So Rumkowski became this really self-appointed mayor, chieftain, whatever you want to call him, of the Lodz ghetto. And basically he decided who would live and who would die. So the Nazis got off the hook. They handed over these selection procedures largely to Rumkowski. And it meant that, of course, he was protected because the Nazis found him useful, and he made decisions about who would live and who would die. My father has quite a story that he was in the offices where Rumkowski was, seeing Engineer Gutmann being given his assignments for the day. And somebody came in and started telling Rumkowski mainly, but they were in the room next door. Did he know that these selections of people on the trains that Rumkowski was making, that they were going to death camps and they were gassing and burning Jews? And Rumkowski stood up and whacked this guy with a backhander across the face and said, "I don't want you to ever spread those filthy lies." Well, we know they were not lies. And there was every evidence that Rumkowski knew exactly where these people were going. Yeah. And he would decide, which section of the ghetto was being cleansed this week. And were they women over the age of whatever. He made those decisions. And I don't want to say which camp he ended up being deported to, but he lasted 10 minutes in the camp.
In the Yad Vashem course that I was able to do on Holocaust, the Judenrat, which, the I guess collaborators, if you want to call them that, but this idea of choiceless choices came up, and what do you do when you're confronted with survival and potentially perks for your family, but you've got to make these selections, or even those that wanted to do good things, who do you give the medication to, or which of your children get fed and which doesn't, the horrors that would have been there for everyone. But as you say, there were moments in the ghettos and in other places where maybe, and the debate goes on whether Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did anything anyway, but was everything that happened inevitable? And in many cases people say that it doesn't matter what you would have chosen, but I guess there's dignity and legacy that comes through as well that we need to remember. Yeah.
Oh, look, I think my father, as opinionated as he was about Rumkowski for certain, I remember somebody saying something at a dinner table, remembering that every time there was a gathering of my parents' friends, they always talked Holocaust. So I heard it. Oh, do you remember such and such? Oh, you remember what he did, this guy and that person? So we heard lots and lots of stories. But I very much remember me asking him one day after overhearing one of these and saying, how could they have done that? Who would, I think it was actually women who became prostitutes for the Nazis, were forced to be prostitutes for the Nazis. And I said, how could they do that? It's just terrible and blah, blah. And he said, you never judge. You can never know what you would do standing in that person's shoes. You don't judge.
Yep.
And I really held on to that. As a life value, I wish I could say I never do. That's not true. My father was a much better human than I, but it was a very big lesson that it's very easy to say, I would never do that. You don't know.
Yep.
You don't know what you would do.
And it's a key part of education, Holocaust education today too, is to ensure that you instill that never judge, yeah.
Never judge. But at the end of the day, my father said that he had to be able to look himself in the mirror too. He had to be able to say, I'm okay with that. I didn't love what that choice was, and maybe I wouldn't do it again, but I'm okay with it. And I think you watch movies like Sophie's Choice or others that have people doing things that you think, how do you do that?
I think I remember in The Pianist where the man steals the soup from the woman and it spills on the ground and he gets and starts to lick it off the floor, but it just shows that he was desperate. He knew, like, what a horrible thing for that to go to waste, but the desperation that there was. And what do you do when you're in that position? We can't understand it, and yeah.
We can't, and we can't understand it, and we don't know what we would do. The depths of your courage or resilience until it's tested at that level is a big question mark. So that was very important. So ghetto life was very tough. My grandmother was selected at one point to be deported, and someone who knew my dad came and told him on the building site, your mother's just been rounded up. And where are they? And they'd taken them to this building that was a hospital, and they're on the top floor. So my father managed to cajole someone at the door of the hospital, I don't know if they're German or not, got in and got her out. In fact, talks about don't know how he did it, but his mother hung on to him, like piggybacked on him, and they snuck out the window down a drain pipe.
Oh, wow.
They had better drain pipes than we have now, I think. That was a story he told. But it didn't save them. You know, in August 1944, which was pretty late in the war, they were all shipped to Auschwitz, all of his family, and his little sister had the withered arm. Of course, she was sent immediately to the gas chambers and his mother went with her. His brother, who'd been married, had already been shipped to Auschwitz, never heard of again. And then his father stood in front of him, actually in front of Joseph Mengele, which is quite a story. That man's history is infamous. And my father's father was directed toward the gas chambers, and my father just automatically went to go with him. And Mengele stopped him and said, first you work, you'll die anyhow. Because my father had been working for the last 4 years. He was quite strong. And my grandfather had said to him, you know, stand on a brick, look really tall. And my father wasn't very tall, and look really strong so that you can work.
Once again, for listeners that don't maybe know anything, who was Joseph Mengele?
Oh, he was given the title the Angel of Death, and he was a key part of the selection process when trains arrived at Auschwitz with hundreds, thousands of people. He, amongst many others, of course he didn't do it all by himself, but he oversaw this selection process. And they chose work, death, and anybody over a certain age, anybody who looked a bit emaciated. And of course there were lots of people coming from ghettos and who were absolutely already looking starved and sick. They immediately were selected for the gas chambers. But they needed workers. They needed workers to do all manner of things. And Auschwitz-Birkenau is really two parts. I should call it Auschwitz-Birkenau because they were two parts. Auschwitz part, and I'll talk more about my mother because that's where she was mostly for people who were working. And there were satellite factories around Auschwitz where the workers went to work. Birkenau was purely a death camp, and the barracks in Birkenau were holding pens. People did work, but it was work related to the death. So they stripped bodies, took jewellery, piled up shoes, they fed bodies into the crematoria from the gas chambers, they piled bodies, they buried, all that sort of work that had to be done was largely that. A few did work to repair buildings and that sort of thing, but it's about 1.5 kilometres apart. So they were quite distinct in their roles as well. Obviously, there was quite a bit of movement from Auschwitz to Birkenau, but Joseph Mengele stood there and he was the angel of death and he chose life and death. And I think the picture I have in my head of my father, 5'7", 21-year-old, standing in front of the angel of death and having life chosen for him, it's a picture I have that holds my very presence on earth in my head. Could have gone otherwise.
Yeah. Before we get to, I guess, your father's eventual survival and legacy and life after the Holocaust.
Yep.
What do you know about his early life and him growing up?
Not a whole lot. His family were not a religious family. They were a Zionist family. They were also a family that at the time really looked to assimilation and being part of the culture you're in and so on. He talked a lot about his time in Hashomer. That was his social life, that was his intellectual life, and how much he loved and appreciated. He idolised his older brother, who went to Hashomer and was a communist, and that's actually how he got out of Poland, is that communists got him out. He was much older and he was already married. So he talks a lot about political debate and how important it was and how you couldn't be complacent. You couldn't just leave the political debate to others, that your future, your fate relied on that political debate. And he was very interested in democracy. Poland before the war was a very fledgling democracy, if that. And he was very interested in revolutions, American Revolution, French Revolution. They were fascinating to him about how a whole society can change. And he was a very optimistic man, unbelievable given what he went through. His sense of optimism, suspicious optimism I might call it, was palpable. They were poor, but they made a living, and his mother, he spoke always about how nurturing his mother was and how kind, and it was all through food, of course. Food was everything, but that there was a very strong sense of home in his growing up. So I think he had a very happy childhood. I think anti-Semitism was rife and it was quite dangerous to be Jewish, but it was a big Jewish population in Poland, 3.5 million Jews before the war, and Lodz had a lot of Jews. So I think there was a very vibrant Jewish life, which he really enjoyed.
And to have, all of that stripped away, and it just gives more of that human story about, him grabbing his mum and taking her down that drain pipe, and what it, just picturing that and what would we do now, and having that moment, and then a few years later anyway, she's following her daughter, his sister, to her death, which is, that's what we're talking about, and that's what you live with that legacy, which we'll talk about later too. But just for many listeners would know this, but think about your own family a little bit while you're thinking about this. So your father is working and has been given a reprieve, I guess, by not following his father. What?
He's not working, actually. He's in Birkenau doing very, very little, and actually escapes selections to the gas chambers 3 times.
Wow.
Amazing.
Oh, so when he was told you work first before he was still sent to Birkenau.
He was still sent to Birkenau and was sort of doing bits and pieces. They clearly had not decided what they were doing with him. Yep. And again, we stood and looked at the ruins of his barracks when we did the Roots trip where he was. And these barracks were horse stables, and they held hundreds of people. They were absolutely terrible places. But one time he was in the line for selection to the gas chamber and he just slipped under a barrack that was nearby. And another time he hid in one of the other barracks that was just empty for the time. But in the middle of the night, a man wakes him up. This is 3 weeks in. He's only been in Auschwitz, in Birkenau 3 weeks. At 3 weeks in, somebody wakes him up and says, Kuba. That was his nickname. His name's Jacob. Should talk about my parents' names. His name was Jacob and nickname was Kuba. And this man he'd done a favour for in the Lodge ghetto. And he wakes him up and he says, Kuba, there's a transport going to a coal mine. Get on it. There's no tomorrow for you here. He gets him on this train, and my father works in a coal mine for several months. There was no real way of tracking time very well. So when in my father's testimonies, which he's done a number of, how long were you in the coal mine? I'm not sure. Maybe 2 months. So they pretty much never surfaced. Food and water was brought down, but they pretty much lived down there. Caused a lot of health problems, you can imagine, but they were working and they were fed, and there was no danger of a gas chamber. So this was a real reprieve in the middle of the war. But as the Germans started losing the war, they were then marched, death marches that most people have heard of, and my father ended up in a couple of different camps and then finally in Bergen-Belsen, which is quite a famous camp. It was really by January 45, it was a dumping ground and was liberated in April by British and Scottish troops. And we have a photo of my father in his prison uniform. So ask me how we have a photo of my father in his prison uniform, because that is a great story. It's a great story. So my father was very ill by this time. He had developed typhus in a place called Ullum, which was on the way to Bergen-Belsen, which was really a dumping ground and full of disease. And he was very sick. And a particular Scottish soldier had picked him up and taken him to get some help, sort of checked on him as they'd set up a hospital outside the camp of Bergen-Belsen. They had to burn Belsen to the ground because it was so full of disease. But they set up a hospital, a military hospital, and he came to check on him and took this photo of him, and he saved my father's life. Fast forward a number of years, my father's at a wedding, sitting at a table, and as everybody from that time did, where were you during the war? What did you do during the war? My father says, I was, in concentration camps and was liberated in Bergen-Belsen. And this Scottish man says, I helped to liberate Bergen-Belsen, and pulls a photo out of his wallet, and it's my dad.
Was this in Melbourne?
This was in Melbourne. So
a Scottish man that liberated and took the photo of your father happened to, wow, how does that happen?
I know, and to this day, of course, this man's name's Sam Lee, no longer with us, but I remember asking him, why did you have the photo why did you keep it? He said, it was always to remember, just never forget. It was really interesting. Of course, he was a hero to our family and family friend and amazing. And another amazing coincidence, probably 30, maybe 40 years later, I'm at a Shabbat dinner at the parents of a friend of my daughter's. They were both about 8 years old. And so we're sitting, having Shabbat dinner, telling our respective stories because we were new to each other. And the husband is Scottish, not anything too surprising. And then I tell my father's story, Scottish man, what was his name? Sam Lee. It was this man's uncle.
Wow.
Unbelievable. And in fact, after my father died, I went through some papers, and I don't know why Sam Lee would have given this to my dad, but it was his discharge from the British Army. It was a booklet of his discharge, honourably discharged, and all these lovely things that his captain had said about him. So, of course, I gave that to Jerry, his nephew, and said, "Oh, I think you might want this." Oh. Is that not an extraordinary story?
That's crazy. And such a small world. We say that, but it's like, oh, you're from Melbourne. But from across the world, you know, from this one event, to keep that photo, to have that memory, to have handed those documents over, and then to have that connection again at Shabbat dinner.
Wild. Even when I say it, it kind of sounds like I made this up, but it's too wild to have made up. It's cool, yeah. Really amazing.
So out of your dad's family, who actually survived, and was he able to see again?
So my father's older brother, the one who was much older, 10 years older, survived in Russia, but of course neither of them knew the other had survived. My father went to work in Germany, in a number of different cities in Germany, for the Americans. So a lot of refugees were doing that. My father was married by then to my mother, and he started looking. He knew what had happened to his everybody else because he'd watched it. So he knew they were all murdered in the gas chambers. But he didn't know about his older brother, and he went looking. So he went to the Red Cross, which is everybody did, and he went to Warsaw, where the largest Red Cross agency for the survivors was. And he heard that his brother was dead. He'd been seen apparently on a stretcher somewhere in a hospital. So I don't know that he heard it from the Red Cross or he heard it from someone else in Poland, and really he'd kind of given up. But then my uncle, who was married to my mother's sister, said, "Oh, but I'm just going to try at this other particular place," because he was looking for family too. And my father said, "Look, I'll just give my name, you never know." And he said, "Zylberstein?" And my father said, "Yes." He said, "Someone was here looking for you." My father said, "What?" And established that he was Kuba Zylberstein. It's not that unusual a name. And from Lodge and blah, blah, blah. That's how they found each other. And my uncle had come back to Poland and was living in Warsaw and had been looking for my father.
And he'd come from Russia?
Correct.
Yep. And your dad at this point hadn't left Poland?
After Bergen-Belsen, had not gone back to Poland.
Not gone back to Poland.
No.
Okay. Was staying in like the DP camp sort of stuff?
Stayed in the DP camps from liberation to about December 1945, and then went, I think, to Mannheim and Munich, a couple of other places where he worked.
Yep.
He just went where the work was, and then went to Poland 47, I think, to look for family.
Yep. And when did he get married to your mum then?
December 3rd of December 1945.
Wow.
They did not have a long courtship. My mother had ended up, I'll tell you her story in a bit, but my mother had ended up in Bergen-Belsen as well, and she was relatively well because she'd had a job in the kitchen, and she was helping in the field hospital look after the patients. So she was helping to feed them and so on and so forth. And she met my dad and they married in December. Wow. I think if you speak to survivors, they didn't need long courtships. All they wanted was a family. Mm. And I think that it all happened very quickly, and there was such a need to have a family and stability. They married very quickly.
Yeah, completely understandable.
Yeah.
I would love to now hear about your mother's story, Deb.
So my mother's name's Sara, and her maiden name was Sara Szor, and she grew up in a religious home with one sister. They were very traditional in all their practices, and my mother's grandfather, so that's my great-grandfather, was a scribe. So this was a very important, very prestigious role. Scribes handwrite the Torah, and they handwrite the Torah on basically sheepskin, and it's a elaborately, beautifully crafted sheepskin, but you can't make a mistake. If you can't rub it out, and if a mistake is made, you start again. So it is an incredibly complex, detailed, difficult role. It's an honour to be a scribe. This was an important legacy to my mother, and education was very important, but there were no Jewish girls' schools. So once my mother had finished primary school, which she did go to, even as a Jew, they could go to primary school. They weren't treated very well. But she did win a scholarship to a Polish high school. And then when Russia and Germany divided Poland, she was in the Russian part of Poland. She was born in a town called Białystok, which was known as a real cultural centre for Jews, had a large Jewish population, as many towns in Poland did. And my mother's love for reading certainly established early in life, her sister as well. Learning was highly, highly valued, and she really loved going to school and loved to study. And then under the Russians got to continue that and learned not only Latin but also White Russian as well as Russian. So my mother could speak 5 languages, which is really just quite extraordinary. And that doesn't include Latin because you don't speak Latin. She was completely devoted to her little sister. It is sort of family lore that they wouldn't have survived without each other. They remained that close their entire lives. And we grew up with our cousins. They weren't our cousins, they were our siblings, really, my sister and I. And still to this day, my first cousin, who is alive, very tragically, my other cousin died very young, but we remain as close as sisters, and our kids too, and so on. That legacy of family is very strong. So that really began in those days, way back when my mother was little. She was not domestic. She didn't like cooking. She didn't like housework. It was not anything that she took any interest or pride in. But she, as I say, she loved to read. They did needlepoint, and she was a wonderful sewer. And that actually, bled into her life post-Holocaust too. But she enjoyed it. It was very soothing and calming for her. She was very practical, learned to do a lot with very little, and I think she learned that from home. She came from a modest home, but her mother was a homemaker. But her father was and I hope I've got this right, her father was a type of accountant. Didn't have an accounting degree, but helped local businesses, largely Jewish, to set up their books, keep track of inventory and that sort of thing. So it was quite a cerebral job, even though it didn't have a qualification attached to it.
And how did your mum, you said she ended up in Auschwitz. What was the the story for that to happen?
Bialystok was turned into a ghetto as well, and in much earlier than my father's trip to Auschwitz in 1943, my mother was sent to Auschwitz. Prior to that, her father had been sent to Majdanek, and her mother had been sent to Treblinka. So they were on their own in the ghetto. My mother was 17 at the time. War broke out 39. She was 15. So this was 41. And they went to Auschwitz via Majdanek. And the story is that they saw their father across the fence, and that was the last time they saw him. But they never saw their mother again after she was shipped to Treblinka. They ended up in Auschwitz and they worked. And they worked sewing German uniforms. That was something she knew how to do. She knew how to sew. That was a story she loved to tell, that whenever she could, and she couldn't do it very often, she would sew the lining of the sleeves together so that when the soldier tried to put, it looked perfectly normal from the outside. When he tried to put his arms in, he couldn't.
A little bit of resistance.
Little bit of resistance. He could have torn the stitches easily. Doesn't matter. It was her little victory. Yeah. But her chief motivation throughout the war was to keep her sister safe. And there's a story that she also told where Gitta, my mother's sister's name, got a boil under her arm, very painful and so on. But the bigger issue is if it pops, infection, and that could easily be a death sentence. So my mother talked about how after it popped, that she urinated on the wound because that was the one clean thing they had. Certainly the water they were drinking was not. That was the one clean thing they had. And another time that my aunt, I don't know, had done something or said something. You didn't need to do anything to be punished, of course. But my mother stood up to defend her and spoke up. And so my mother was punished by kneeling in the snow holding 2 bricks above her head. Well, of course, after a time she dropped one of the bricks and the guard threw the brick at my mother's head, and my mother remained deaf in that ear her whole life. Such a strong image of, how little children whisper in their mother's ear. I'd always whisper in the wrong ear and she'd say, other one. And I remember saying, why can't you hear in that ear? And it took her a long time to tell me that was why. She never had any hearing in that ear. She was lucky to survive, really, in many ways. And so then in January 1945, they were on a death march out of Auschwitz, which so many death marches occurred out of the camps, and they were marched to Bergen-Belsen. And they were in Belsen a month, maybe 2 months. As I say, survivors had no way of really keeping good track of time. So they're often very blurry about those things. And she and her sister got a job in the kitchen, which undoubtedly saved them, and met my father, and they got married very quickly and started working. And my mother went to work in a girdle factory in Mannheim, Germany, and a few years later had my sister, and talks about how one of the German nurses wanted to hold my sister after she was born, and my mother wouldn't let her touch her. She said, "Don't you touch my daughter." And she talked about it in a kind of I didn't care who she was. A German wasn't touching my daughter.
It's amazing that the transformation of Germans that would all of a sudden want to look after Jews, and treat them as humans after what had just happened. And I guess there was some choiceless choices for many Germans too, but that fairly quick transformation, it's just weird how humans can do such horror and then try and flip it to go back to normal, although we don't try not to judge. But
well, you read a book like Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen, which makes you despair about humanity a little. But I think living in Germany after the war was excruciating for them, and they could not wait to get out. They tried very hard to get out as early as they could, but they had no money, they had nothing, and no one was paying for their passage anywhere. Lots of sponsorships were provided to certain level, but you still had to have passage. You had to get to Italy to get on the ship. No one was paying for that. And there were refugee camps all over, and there were hundreds of thousands of people trying to rebuild their lives. Really, of course, they had no one and nothing, but they had each other. And we still have lots of connections to my parents' friends that they developed in after the war, and who looked after each other, who sponsored each other to come out to Australia or to wherever they ended up.
Was it just your mother and her sister that survived?
Correct. No one else.
And your sister was born in Germany?
Correct.
Displaced persons camp?
No, in Mannheim.
In Mannheim.
That was 49.
49.
So it was a good few years
Yep.
after they were liberated.
Yeah. And they were still considered refugees at that point? There was no passport or citizenship given?
No, they were stateless.
Yeah.
They were stateless, and they had papers that the Americans had given them. And hilariously, when my father died, we really had to discuss what was his birth year for the tombstone, because he had papers that said he was born in 1921, some that said 22 and some that said 23, because he'd put his age up and down according to need. So in 1939, he put it up to go fight against the Nazis. Then in Germany after the war, he put it down so that he could do a course in building, and he had to be under 21 or something like that. And so we kind of took a punt on the one bit of paper that seemed to be most prevalent. So they had nothing, no papers, no nothing. And they managed to, the Bialystok Centre in Melbourne sponsored them after their visa to Israel was denied. It sponsored them to come out. And so they came out on the ship, the Napoli, which came via Perth, came via India, as a matter of fact, Mumbai. And my father, they had one cabin for the four of them, because my cousin had been born shortly after my sister, and had one cabin. So the girls had the cabin, and my father and uncle slept with the potatoes. My father said he couldn't look at a potato for a very long time after that, the smell.
And then had to work with them.
Then had to work with them. I know it's a bit ironic, isn't it? I hadn't thought of that. But when they went off the ship into Mumbai, he was just horrified that there were beggars. And he went back on the ship and got potatoes and gave them. Oh, wow. He could not bear to see starving people. It broke his heart. He couldn't do it. So that's kind of really quite amazing. And the Bialystok Centre had a house in Robe Street, St Kilda. Now, do you know what Robe Street is quite famous for?
No.
It's prostitutes and brothels.
I imagine I said yes.
Imagine if you had said yes. Interesting thought. That would have been...
No judgment.
No judgment. Anyway, so my mother talks about how she would be pushing my sister down the street in her stroller next to the prostitutes pushing their children down the street in their strollers. Hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
But it gave them a start.
Yeah.
And waiting at the docks were General Motors and lots of other big factories, and my father went to work for General Motors.
Wow. Okay. Was the Napoli ship, did that leave from Genoa?
It did.
Okay. So Stephen Lindner, who was, we recorded a couple of episodes ago, talked about leaving from Genoa and also trying out for General Motors, but was quickly realised he wasn't made for working at General Motors. Did your father last long working there?
I think about a year.
Okay.
And then he worked somewhere else. But he has a lovely story about being in the lunchroom at General Motors. And he's sitting there in the lunchroom, and a fellow sitting next to him saying hello, blah, blah. And he says, "Oh, what church do you go to?" My father thinks, okay, here we go. I'm going to be fired. He's going to punch me in the face. He doesn't know what these Australian workers are going to say about him being Jewish. And he said, I'm Jewish. And the fellow says, that's nice, but what church do you go to? And he just said, what church do you go to? He had no idea what the term Jewish meant. My father said he almost kissed him. That this fellow had no concern, no issue, didn't even know what it was. That was astounding to him. My father loved Australia. He thought Australia was the lucky country and that he was so fortunate to be here. Joined the Labor Party, was very active. I used to help letterbox in the days where you did those things. With my father, I'd walk on one side of the street and he'd walk on the other. As I said, right from his early age, he said, you don't sit back.
So you talked about your dad being in the fruit business.
Yep.
And then also a member of the Labor Party. Was there anything else that you'd like to share about him?
He didn't love the fruit business, but he did love building, which he obviously developed quite a lot of skill, and he also built a building for the Americans after the war, because there was a lot of, obviously, repair to be done to Germany. And my parents had a fruit shop for about 20 years, and in the last 5 years of that time, he and my uncle, my mother's sister's brother, bought into a building company, and he became a builder.
Oh, wow. So good to do it.
Which he loved and did for the rest of his life and made a comfortable living and just loved it. I think it was only the last maybe 5 or 6 years of his life that he really retired and stopped. And
your mum, what did she do?
She worked in the fruit shop and she joined Wizzo, and the year after I did my HSC, as it was then, before being called VCE, the year after that she did HSC English. I was more proud of her result than I was of my own. I just thought that was just wonderful. And even after the fruit shop, she did courses. She was quite young. In 1983, she was 53. She was diagnosed with a brain tumour and she died 6 years later. So they were very different years. But even in the first year after being diagnosed, she was well and she insisted on doing a course, and I think she was always sad that she didn't have an education and could do something professional. But you'd never have known. She was never bitter. She was never angry. She was very grateful for the life she had.
Deb, in your adulthood, what would you say was the biggest impact of growing up in a Holocaust survivor household? What do you think your early adulthood was like because of it? Or was it a life that was really influenced by that, at least in your early adulthood?
Oh, I think it was pivotal to choices I made about career and where I went to university even. I wrangled in upper high school in perhaps a very teenage all or nothing bit of black and white sort of thinking that whatever career I chose, it had to be about making a difference, changing the world. I was going to change the world. And I'd toyed with the idea of doing law, but just was sort of despondent about, how many years would it take to become a judge at a level that you could make a difference, and up till then, would you be able to make a difference? And so I decided that I wanted to be a teacher. Mind you, my parents will tell you that from the age of 3 or 4, I would round up the neighbourhood children and I was the teacher and they had to do what I told them. I learned to read very early. I went to a Montessori kindergarten and they just taught me to read before I went to school. So I was very pushy about that. So I think maybe I was meant to be a teacher. I've only been doing it 40 years, so maybe I was. But I was very selective about where I would study, and La Trobe University had a very innovative course where instead of doing your bachelor of whatever you were doing, then doing a dip ed, you actually took on an education subject every year for 4 years. So you immersed yourself in a school every year. You did a placement and so on, and I loved that course. Now, La Trobe University was a long way from Bentley when there really wasn't public transport at all out to La Trobe. By then it was like one bus a day or something, and it took 2 hours. Didn't have a car. No, there was no prospect of having a car at that age. So I got a scholarship. I got a Commonwealth scholarship, and I lived at La Trobe University, which was radical for an 18-year-old in a Jewish family at that age. Radical. I also think I needed to spread my wings. I felt a bit cocooned in my life at home and in Hashemer and so on and so forth, and I was ready to be a bit radical. It was a radical place. It was pretty on fire in the 70s, Vietnam War movement and so on. So it was very interesting. It was also, Yom Kippur War. It became quite anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. They're often the same, tragically. And I remember finding it the largest Magen David I could and wearing it boldly.
Were there many other Jewish students?
Not many. I had a few people I knew, a few friends, but there was no Jewish community.
And even the Yom Kippur War, which was a clear invasion on the holiest day of the year, was still considered an Israeli issue, that they're there at fault.
Absolutely.
Things don't change.
Things don't change. Anyway, so that was kind of interesting. And I chose my placements all over the shop. I did a country placement and so on. And then my last placement was at a technical school that they existed back then, Heidelberg Tech, all boys tech, tough place, but I fell in love with it. It certainly suited my sensibility. I was going to work where the need was greatest, and I loved it. In one of my placements, I helped out with the school musical. Now, I'd always had a big interest in theatre and dance and so on. That was just something I loved to do. My sister danced, did ballet and all that stuff. And at uni I did too. So once I started teaching, in that placement I'd helped out with school musical, and I saw the kids who academically didn't have much joy, even socially didn't succeed much. But if they could be on stage, if they could make the sets, if they could make the costumes, turn the lights on, they had a place. They belonged. Ultimately, everybody wants to belong, to be needed, to be a part of something. And it really shifted me. And so at this all-boys tech, I'm 21, Matt. I'm 21, 4'11", 150 centimetres. These boys are huge. And I'm said to the music teacher, I think we should have a school musical. They're looking at me and going, who is this person?
And it's Heidelberg, so I know it well because I'm from that area, and it's a really still a tough place in at least West Heidelberg and that area. So
that's where it was.
Yeah, wow.
And this was West Heidelberg,
yeah.
And mostly welfare class families,
yeah.
And they looked at me as though I'd lost my mind, and the music teacher said, if you can pull it off, I'll help you. So we did school musicals. Long story short, I won't go into all the politics of the place, but I ended up opening a youth theatre at the local, do you remember the Tri Youth and Community Services Centre? They had a big hall, mostly used for basketball. And when I stopped doing the musicals at that school, then I started the youth theatre, which went for about 5 years, I guess. Wow. Then I taught at Preston East Technical School, which had the largest Aboriginal Koori community in the metropolitan area. And we did some amazing work, and we started a sub-school that was a performing arts sub-school. It was for years 7 to 9, and we taught all the disciplines but through the performing arts.
Wow. Was that attached near Northland? Is that
It is
exactly?
now
And
called
it's
Northland Secondary College.
Yeah, and there was a performing arts, or still is, a component to it. So that's where
Correct.
you were. Okay.
And
That's where I grew up, that area.
Well,
so.
I started that.
Wow.
And that was really very exciting times. And as part of that, I worked with the local Rotary Club, who provided scholarships to students at Preston East to keep them in school. A lot of families sent their kids out to work. They needed the money. They were not motivated to keep their kids in school. And look, it costs money. Even at a government school, it costs money to stay in school. There's uniform and books and they're not earning. So I worked with them. And then one day the Rotary Club of Preston said, look, there's this program called Group Study Exchange. We'd like to sponsor you to go to another part of the world and study education. And I said, okay. So the school gave me the leave, and so I spent, I don't remember how long it was now, maybe 2 months, in Texas studying education. And that's where I met my future husband. Yeah, that's wild. I know it sounds ridiculous. But I was by then 33 and had a couple of sort of long-term relationships. And that was part of the pressure of the legacy, I guess, that for whatever reason, these relationships had not been with Jewish men. The Jewish community, I think, felt for me a little bit too claustrophobic, yet many people, not just survivors, felt it was a betrayal of the Jewish people to not marry a Jew. My father was less... My mother died when I was young, so it really sort of wasn't so much a question. But, my father was pretty even-tempered about it. He said, look, you're Jewish, your children will be Jewish, that's what I care about. And the rest of the family wasn't perhaps so easy about it. At that stage, intermarriage was reasonably rare and frowned upon. That it was a real betrayal. After the Holocaust, what did you want to do? Build back the communities, and I was betraying that. But when I was 33, I met my future husband and we married and I moved to America. Interestingly, ironically, well, first of all, before we got engaged, we had a summit. He'd come to Australia to visit, met my family, and we went on a holiday in Queensland and we had a summit. We knew why we wanted to get married. That was easy. We loved each other, but could we make it work? So we sat separately and wrote down all the reasons we should not get married. And that was a long list. And so we battled it out over a number of days. And finally, at the end of thrashing out all these arguments, we decided we could get married. And one of those battles was, how will we raise the children? And my late husband came from quite an observant Christian family. So that was a challenge for him, except that it was not. He said, as long as we're doing it properly, if they're going to be Jewish, we're doing everything. And we didn't have a Christmas tree, and they went to Sunday school and we went to synagogue. And after we moved back here to Australia, which is another story, when my son was preparing for his bar mitzvah, it was my late husband who took him to synagogue every Saturday and did a Hebrew course so he could help him, and he was totally devoted to bring up the children Jewish.
Did he convert?
No, he did not. We talked about it quite a few times. I think he would never have converted while his mother was alive. I think it would have hurt her feelings too much, and he really respected her. But ironically, his older sister had converted to Judaism some years before. I know, wacky, weird, who would have thought it? They're Cohens. Just saying.
Okay.
And anybody who knows that Cohens are, first of all, it's a very well-known Jewish name, but it's also a very particular tribe of Israel.
Is the priest
it's
class?
It's the priest class,
oh, yeah.
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So I know, weird. So many wheels within wheels in my story out there, Matt. Yeah. But there was a weight of both legacy and history. And I think, it's a weight that is a privilege as much as it is a burden, if you like. But it does carry both elements. And so those choices as a young adult to move away from the Jewish community, move to La Trobe to study, and then work in Preston, and I bought a house in McLeod. Who does that if you're a good Jewish girl? Not to marry till very late, which was also unusual. To get married at 35 was unheard of, and to marry out, as the term is described, all felt problematic. And I still probably run the guilt around in my head. What if I had done it differently? Maybe I should have. I mean, I don't regret my life at all, but, the what ifs that you say to yourself. But that's very driven by that guilt.
Is it a guilt that that you did things for yourself, that you were looking out for you in a way to explore life and see what it's all about, but there was this expectation, but also you felt like you owed your parents that had gone through so much and all the people that they were, in contact with, and still, Melbourne's Jewish population or community is very much a Holocaust community and survivor community. Did it feel like a betrayal to that legacy to build back as Jews and as build it back to what it might have been?
Very much all of what you said, a personal guilt that, was hard for my parents not to see their daughter getting married to a good Jewish boy and having a family in Caulfield and so on, but also to my community, that I'd let my community down. And, that question, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And I think it still resonates with me. I don't think you take it off like a coat. I think that guilt is, there's survivor guilt. Are you doing enough? That my parents certainly had. And guilt in my head, am I doing enough? And I still say that to myself every day. Am I doing enough? Is there more I should be doing? What else could I have done? And I don't want that to sound, poor me. I don't think that at all. I've had an incredibly privileged life, and I'm so grateful for it and for my children. But I do think that guilt sort of runs around, and I think there's a very great weight that the Holocaust places now in terms of October the 7th. Because, my father particularly always said, don't get too comfortable. Yes, everything's lovely. You've got this lovely job and you've got these lovely friends and you do whatever you want and you're paid and you've got all these people around you who are lovely and love you for now. Don't get too comfortable. I used to go, yes, but Papa, this is Australia and, it's a new world. It's post-Holocaust and post-Israel. He was right. And I'm so grateful he's not alive to see this. My sister and I say this all the time, that for our parents or for any Holocaust survivors who are alive to see post-October the 7th, devastating. They thought, okay, we've paid the price. Our families have paid the price. But now our legacy, our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be okay. And this is beyond painful from that perspective. It's hard on my children who are surrounded by young voices who demand that they are listened to, and it's very hard for them. And the weight of their grandparents, and my children did not know my mother, but they were very close to my father. It's a huge weight on them now. They're navigating the arts community. They're both in the arts. They're navigating that community. The LGBTQI community, which is also very vocal in this space, very challenging for them.
And it would be, and you talked about your dad being part of the Labor Party and so a progressive on the left, which used to be a big defender of Israel, and that shifting a little bit. I wouldn't say shifted completely, but, there's a shift there. And as you said, young voices, progressive voices so-called progressive voices, that, yeah, it's a very difficult space, and I can't imagine what they're going through. Your children, you can introduce your children actually if you'd like.
Yes, certainly. My son John is 31. He's been living in New York for the last 3 years, and very interestingly, and I hope you'll get to interview him too, Matt, he is part of the third generation New York, which is quite a solid community of the third generation who preserve their grandparents' stories in histories in a number of different ways. He's part of an arts group collective that are putting on a performance of these vignettes of their grandparents' stories. And so I haven't seen it. I've not read a single word because he doesn't want me to. He wants me to, when it's filmed, because it will be filmed, to see it in total. And it's dance, monologue and projections. That's all I know about it. I'm not allowed to know more yet. Yeah, so he's very busy getting prepared for that, which is very exciting. He's also been part of the National Yiddish Theatre Volksbühne, which preserves Yiddish culture and performance, and has just been cast in Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish to be performed in Los Angeles, which is wild.
Yeah.
And his piece about my father has been picked up by a theatre festival in New York. So it's going to be performed in an extended version. So now he's got to extend the version. He's a very busy young man for that festival later in September. So he's very immersed in the Jewish community there. He's been a tour guide at the Holocaust Museum, and he has given my dad and mum's testimony to school groups in New York as well. So he's been very immersed in the Jewish community there.
I think that the way that you've lived your life, Deb, would be, although you're feeling some guilt with it, that you live to give back always, and that has to be a part of it. But with your part of the positive and that legacy, but with your, I guess, guilt, did you ensure that your children had an understanding and a drive to understand their grandparents' history?
Absolutely. I was fortunate enough to be able to send my children to the King David School, which obviously has Holocaust studies, but they both went on a program called March of the Living, whereby students in Year 11 are taken to Poland, and they do a whole program visiting incredibly important sites, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the various ghettos and various sites. And everybody takes a testimony with them. And they took my father's testimony with them. And John gave my father's testimony at Radegast train station outside Lodz, where my father was deported to Auschwitz. Now that's a moment. And my daughter also did it and gave testimony actually out at Auschwitz of my mother's story. Yes, they had a very strong connection to Holocaust and Jewish legacy.
And your daughter's name?
Sara.
Which is named after?
My mother.
Your mother, yeah.
Yes. It does give me great joy to use my mother's name all the time.
What would you say, Deb, is the biggest piece of legacy, the biggest driver for you in life today, and how does it connect with, the life that you've had, but also your parents?
Yeah. I would have to say the importance of family and the importance of seeing your life as a gift that you have to share, that I guess I come back to that adage, if I'm not for me, who am I? If I'm only for me, what am I? And you can't be just for you. And family, giving to your family, giving to your work. Work is such a privilege, and I'm so fortunate to do a job that I love and feel so inspired by the people I work with and the children that I work with. But I just think to see every day as a gift, I know it sounds so trite, But I do know what every day meant to my parents, and they were incredibly grateful for it, and imbued me with the don't take anything for granted. Not your life, not your children, not your health, not your work, to appreciate everything. And we all have moments where we go, oh, this is hard, I don't want to get up in the morning, or I wish I could travel business class, or, those that sound so spoiled. I'll often sort of hear my father or my mother. My mother wasn't quite as direct about it. My father's much more so. Come on, get over yourself. And I think I'm so grateful for the legacy I have. It sounds bizarre, but that it's really taught me so much about how to live my life.
Thank you, Deb. Working with you at Bialik and being so lucky to be in different meetings and watch you communicate with parents and help them through some difficult times, managing different things that kids go through and teenagers go through, and to give back in the way that you do is a gift. So you're giving back, that's for sure, from family and work and beyond. So thank you for everything that you're doing and have done, and it was great to hear from you today.
Thanks for allowing me to tell my story, Matt.
Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialik community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people, and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialik College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, follow, review and share. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Thank you to Bialik College and all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make Their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialik College Parents Association for their support in the podcast, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem and the Gandalf Foundation. Please check out the show notes for links and any additional information. See you next time.